I hope you enjoyed it. It's Mary Tyler Moore Show, and it's really not one of my favorite shows, but I found that clip and I enjoyed it. Figured I'd share it because today we start talking a little bit about legacy and what we leave behind when we go from this place. Because as we saw in the video, people react differently to what our legacies are. But they're reacting to what we've left behind, what our life has added up to, and what our times and our actions and how they've impacted the world around us. And so we have legacies, and we all have legacies. Moses had a legacy. We've been talking about the ancient Israelites for the past month or so now, and you can't talk about them without talking about Moses. You've seen he's figured very large in what we've been learning about. Moses, the leader of the ancient Israelites. And today we come kind of to the end of that part of Israelite history. As we close this little section of sermons, we look at Moses and how he went from this earth and what he left behind. And we see in his death, he leaves behind a legacy of complete obedience and service to God. But how did Moses leave this earth? Well, let's talk a little bit about Moses. Well, we know by God's power, Moses led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. And they went and they kind of walked around the desert for a while. And God said, all right, people of Israel, go. Here's the land, the good land, the prosperous land I promised your ancestors. Go and take it. And if you recall from last week, if you were able to be here, the people said, no, we're afraid or whatever. And they didn't have faith in God, and they disobeyed God. And they rebelled against God. They grumbled against God, and therefore brought God's judgment down upon them. So God said, hey, for the next 40 years now, instead of going and settling into this good land, you're going to just wander around this desert for 40 years. And over the next 40 years, everyone who's 20 years old or older is going to die in this desert, while I raise up a new generation of faithful people in me. And the only three who kind of made it through this 40 years in the desert are Moses, and then Joshua and Caleb, who were faithful to God all along when the rest of the people rebelled. And so they go through these 40 years, and during these 40 years of death and renewal, God calls Moses to be their leader still. And you can just imagine what Moses was thinking. Oh, it's already been so tough, and these people are not easy. But God says, Moses, you be their leader. And even though the Israelites came to a place where they were obedient to God, it took them a long time to learn that lesson. It took the full 40 years for the people to become the people of God, to come to that place where they didn't just say they would do everything that God said to do. They actually became those people who were doing everything God said. But it took 40 years. And so those 40 years of them learning this lesson were very tough on Moses. Because the people, while they were learning this lesson, they still rebelled at times. They still went away from where God was leading, and they grumbled. They grumbled against Moses. They grumbled against God. And we actually see in Scripture times Moses goes to God, and he pretty much says, God, why did you stick me here with these people? But if you're someone who is in leadership, or you aspire to leadership in your workplace, or in the church, or maybe at your school, or in the community, you're in some sort of community group or some community team doing something, I want you to pay attention to Moses. Because Moses teaches us so much about leadership. Because Moses, even though he's totally fed up with these people, he is 100% utterly devoted and committed to the God who put him in leadership of these people. And so he remains true to the people because he's true to God. And so he leads the people these long 40 years through the desert. And finally, after 40 years, God brings the people back to the edge of the promised land. He says, I'm going to give this land to you now. But he says, Moses, first, call an assembly. So Moses calls an assembly of all the people, and he repeats to all the people all the rules and all the laws God has given them for holy, righteous living in this new land. And Moses reminds all the people of the great things God has done for them and how great God has been throughout these years. In an impossible circumstance, God has provided for them everything they needed. It's there. And Moses tells them, remember all these things and live by them. Above all, honor God, revere God. It's like Moses knows he's leaving these people with something. Because when Moses gets done with the assembly, God says, Moses, I need you to go up to Mount Nebo. And from there you're going to look out over And you're going to see the Holy Land. This land I promised you people. You're going to see how good and beautiful and wonderful it is. I'm going to give that to you, Moses. And you're going to die there. And we read God says this to Moses, and we're like, wait, what? No, that's right. After everything Moses has done, after decades of leading the people, after constant rock-solid faith, Moses doesn't get to enter the promised land. I mean, he kind of is teased with a glimpse of it, but he doesn't get to go there. And we read that and we think, God, that's just not fair, right? We think it's not fair. Anyone ever thought that when you read about Moses not getting to the promised land? It's not fair, because that's what our culture teaches us. Our culture teaches us, we think we work hard for something and we go after it. Well, then we earn something at the end. We are entitled to the benefit. Listen, we're just not worthy of it, but we're entitled to it. It's ours. Don't hold it back. But God doesn't make that agreement with us when he calls us to work for him, to serve him. We don't always see or get all the good results of our work for God in this lifetime. God promises to build his church. He promises that all things are going to work together for good to his glory, and he calls us to serve him and others in all those endeavors. But he never says, across the board, you work for me, you're going to see all the glory, you're going to get all the benefit for us. We never get the promise that every time we serve God, we are going to participate in the benefits that buys. He doesn't say that anywhere. So when we decide we're going to be like Moses and we're going to obey God, we're going to serve God, we need to believe behind this sense of entitlement that just comes on people. When God calls us to be his light in this world, and that means maybe in the workplace where you work, he wants you to be his light, the building where you live, in your school, in your family and in your home. God says, be my light. It might mean that we take time and we take the risks to talk about and speak the words of the gospel of Jesus Christ to people. It may mean working hard and giving up some things so that we can do things for other people to show our love, to show God's love in a tangible way. It may mean giving up our time and our energy in an effort to bring somebody into faith in Jesus Christ who just doesn't seem to want to be there. God says, go be my light. But when he does, and we obey like Moses obeyed, you may not experience the payoff, the benefits of that in your lifetime. This is what Moses teaches us. That person you minister to every day may or may not come to faith in Jesus Christ in your lifetime. The congregation, your church, you sacrifice so much to build and to go forth to the vision that perhaps God has given you, you may not see it accomplished in your lifetime. If anything, in anything God calls you to, you may not experience the fullest result of what God is doing before you pass from this earth. You might not see it. And we need to accept that. See, because our joy is in serving God with obedient hearts. We're not entitled to anything else after that. If God does sometimes give us something, well, that's just an extra gift. You see, part of Moses' legacy is serving God wholeheartedly without this expectation. He doesn't develop this mentality of entitlement. I deserve the Holy Land, God. God tells Moses, you need to go up to the mountain and I'm going to show you the Holy Land, but Moses, you're not going to enter it. You're going to die there. And you see, the great thing about Moses is there's no indication here that he argues with God. There's no, but after everything I've done, don't I deserve it? That doesn't come from Moses. All we get is quiet submission from the man of God who has been following God all these decades. We wouldn't expect anything else from him. You see, we read in the scriptures, we get to this part when we're reading through our Bibles, and we see God saying, Moses, you're going to die, you're not going to enter the Holy Land. And that kind of catches us up. We think, oh, that's a surprise to us. We think certainly Moses is going to make it. But you see, probably didn't come as a surprise to Moses, because God had told Moses, you're not going to enter the Holy Land. Now, why would God say something like that to Moses? Moses, this man whose legacy we're looking at. Because one time in all those years, Moses didn't do things God's ways. He was doing something for God. He was passionate about doing God's work, but he didn't do it God's way. Here's what was going on. They were in the desert. Of course they were in the desert. And it was a place where they got to, and they ran out of water. They didn't have any water with them, and there was no water in the desert. And the people were thirsty. They were dirty. They were tired. And they were grumpy, because there's no water. And so they grumble. It's what they always did. And they start blaming it's Moses' fault. And then it gets to it's God's fault. And so God says to Moses, Moses, take the people to this certain rock in the desert and gather them around. And in their presence, in front of all of them, I want you to speak to the rock. And I will cause water to flow out of that rock. And that's how I will provide water for my people. Moses is like, okay, so he gathers all the people around the rock. But before Moses has a chance to carry this out, guess what all the people are doing? They're grumbling. They're just like, Moses, this is terrible. What are you doing? And it gets so overwhelming. It gets so frustrating. It gets so irritating that Moses just loses all patience. Have you ever been there? Anyone who's ever been with children, you've been there. And so Moses, and just a kind of lack of all patience and frustration, he just takes his staff and he just bangs on the rock. Now, God had told him to speak to the rock. And because God loves his people, God takes care of his children, God does send the water forth for the people. But God says to Moses afterwards, he says, Moses, since you didn't trust me enough to honor me before all of Israel, he says, since you didn't do it my way, you're not going to enter the Holy Land. You see, there's consequence when we don't do things God's way. Right? So part of Moses' legacy is this lesson of how we honor God and his word in our lives. It's not enough to have good intentions. It's not enough to just want to do something for God. But we've got to do it God's way. So often we get this idea that we're going to do something for God and we don't care how we get there. But I got to tell you, it's no good if doing something for God means we cheat, or we lie, or we have to do some things dishonestly, or we have to participate in some sort of behavior that God would disapprove of. If I'm doing it all to do something great for God, no. God says you got to do it my way. See, in Moses' death, we're reminded of this legacy that he leaves, this idea that we are to honor God and what God says into our lives through his word, through his Holy Spirit whispering to us. Too often, we approach God flippantly and we are not honoring him fully. We don't trust him enough to honor him fully. We approach God in a flippant, disrespectful way. Case in point, it reminded me of just something that happened at home this week at the dinner table. And one of the kids was involved, and I won't mention the child because some of you think I talk about her unfairly because she couldn't possibly be that uninnocent. But but we were at the dinner table, and many of you know I share a home with my sister and her husband and their 3 kids. And so I'm there, we're over dinner, my brother-in-law Pete and I were talking, he's a pastor too, so we're talking about something going on in the community that involved the churches. I don't even remember what it was. And we're having a pretty in-depth conversation, and then one of the children from the other end of the table speaks into our conversation. Daddy, will you shut up? I'm trying to talk to my mother. It did not go well for that particular child. But it reminded me, isn't that how we approach God so often? We don't honor him. The way God says to Moses, you didn't honor me. So God's legacy is a lesson in honoring God and humbly accepting the consequences when we fail to do that. God says, Moses, go up to the mountain, you're going to see the land, but you're not going to enter it, you're going to die there. And Moses accepts that. He doesn't argue, he doesn't rant and rail. He doesn't, how dare you, God, this is all your fault, after everything I've done for you. No. Moses accepts the consequences of where he failed. Moses accepts the consequences of his sin. He knows God has forgiven him, but there's still consequences here that he has to deal with. And he just accepts them. And Moses does that, and he leaves with us that legacy of how we handle our own short failings when we have to pay the price for them. So what fully is Moses' legacy? And we read it in Deuteronomy 34, verses 10 to 12. It's the final verses of the chapter, and this is what it says after Moses passes. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miraculous wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to this whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Listen, there's never been a greater prophet in the world than Moses. No mere human has ever, by God's power, ever accomplished so much for God and by God as Moses did. Moses, so humble, so obedient to God, that he met with God face to face. He spoke with God face to face. Anyone here ever done that? And so God did great things through Moses. That's his legacy. And the thing about Moses' legacy, perhaps the greatest in the history of the world, is it didn't come about by accident. It didn't come about as an afterthought. It's not as though Moses, at year 35 of leading the people in the desert, looked at the calendar one day and said, God said it was going to be 40 years and I wouldn't make it past 40 years and it's 35 years. I've only got 5 years to make something of myself. No. Moses, it's not as though he said at any point he could have gone back to his father-in-law Jethro and had a pretty nice life there. But no, instead Moses stayed and was diligent and was careful about what he did and how he lived. Now, the reason Moses left such a great legacy is because since the moment God appeared to him in that burning bush way back in Egypt, Moses served God. Moses followed God. Moses obeyed God and didn't look back at all. Didn't look back at all. He was very deliberate in living out his faith. Sure, when God first appeared to him in that burning bush, Moses had some objections. But when God finally said to Moses, Moses, go, Moses went. No looking back. In humility, he accepted the difficult, sometimes brutal task that God set before him. In faith, he trusted that God would take care of him and all the people that God had put under his care. And he exhausted himself to go and do everything God called him to do without expecting anything in return. And what's the result? What comes of this? A whole generation of people brought up under Moses' leadership who are now obedient to God. A whole generation of people who aren't anything like the generation that Moses started with, their parents. The people of Israel are now a transformed people. The people of Israel, they're now God's chosen people, not just in name, but by in actions and what they're doing. See, that's Moses' legacy, and it didn't come by accident or as an afterthought. It came from hard work and deliberate faith. So what do we do? All right, Moses, great. Moses leaves a legacy. What do we do with this in our life? It makes me ask, what is our legacy? What is your legacy? As Moses proved, leaving a godly legacy, it can take decades. It's time to start now. You're never too young or old to start leaving a godly legacy behind. Everyone will leave something behind. Whether you know it or not, you're already leaving something behind. Everyone here, regardless of how old you are, has someone younger than you looking up to you, has someone less experienced at something looking up to you and wanting to know, what is the godly way to pursue this? When you're gone from this place, when you're gone from the place you are now, maybe your work, maybe you get a new job, maybe you retire. When you're gone from where you live now or the people you live with now, when you're gone from maybe your school, perhaps maybe when you're gone from this community or this body of believers, who knows where you'll go. When you're gone from here, what will the people you leave behind say about you? What will be their reaction to your legacy? Will they say, hey, I was blessed by God for having them in my life? Will they say, the hand of God was at work in your life because you let God work in your life? Will they say that you taught them about faith and how you lived, the things you did, the things you say, and the words you spoke about the gospel of Jesus Christ? Will they say they know what it means to love God? They know what it means to honor God because they saw you doing it? Well, they say they know what it means to be loved by God because they experienced it through you. What are they going to say? You see, no matter what your age is, you're leaving a legacy. What is God telling you you need to do or you need to be right now so that those coming up behind you are even more righteous than you are? That's legacy. If you want to leave behind a legacy of faith, a legacy of obedience and service to God, if you want to leave behind a godly legacy, well, we need to start. There's some things we need to do. We need to be deliberate. It doesn't come by accident. So we need to sit down and we need to look at our lives and we need to figure out, what's in the way of me fully trusting God? What's in the way of me fully honoring God in my life? And we need to meditate and reflect on how to better honor God and obey what He has called us to do. What can I do? Not just have good intentions, but do good things the way God says to do them, because that's what makes them good. And we need to start today. See, we all have a legacy that we are building right now. We are all going to leave something behind. The question for you is, will your legacy be one of great transformational power of God at work in your life, the way we see through Moses? Or will your legacy be one of squandered opportunity? Let's pray.